So we are. Wait a second. What is that? Is that Alec Baldwin?
It is. He's quite the advocate, you know.
The advocate for what?
Gun control.
Oh, man. You know, it's one thing to be an advocate for something, it's another thing to actually know the detailed history of what you're advocating about.
I think it was too soon to, do.
No, I don't think it's ever too soon for anything. And it's never too soon to start this show. So let's get started. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Sons of History podcast. I am Dustin Bass.
And I am Alan Wakim.
That's right. And go Astros. Congratulations on making it to another World Series, third World Series in 5 years. Jeff Passan, whatever at ESPN can suck it. That guy is garbage. Anyways, not that I have a bone to pick with the guy. I did miss a grand opportunity last week, and I do want to make amends for this, ladies and gentlemen. My brother's birthday, we mentioned it in last week's episode, and I forgot to say, let's go, Brandon. So
That would have been good.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Let's go, Brandon.
Well, since we're talking about people, I want to thank Sharon Leal of Sharon Leal Salon for, she's getting our name out.
Yeah.
So.
Big promo for what we're doing.
Yep. So
Thank you very much, Sharon. And speaking of promo, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It'd be a huge help. And then tell your friends and family about it. And if you are running low on finances this Christmas, just buy them a subscription to our podcast or YouTube channel.
You get what you pay for, right?
Yeah, you do. Amen to that. Boy. All right. So I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have. But before we do, new section. Well, it's no longer the new section.
It's not new anymore.
It was new a number of weeks ago.
But it's still great.
It's still wonderful.
Yeah.
This week in history.
Okay. Now, I briefly mentioned this last week. October 23rd to October 26th of 1944. The greatest naval battle of the Second World War, quite possibly. Some historians have stated that that was the greatest naval battle in the history of warfare. Mm-hmm. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, the Philippines used to be an American colony, and Douglas MacArthur was driven out of there. You had the Bataan Death March, Corregidor. Well, when Douglas MacArthur was kicked out, ordered back to Australia by FDR, he vowed that he would return to the Philippines. Well, in October, he came back. I shall return. That's what Douglas MacArthur said. So, they had a landing in the island of Leyte, which was right in the middle of the Philippines. Now, the Japanese were like, you know what? We know what he's going to do. We're going to try to trap them. We're going to create a bait, a little, So that's what they did. And Admiral Halsey took the bait. This is what happened. There were 4 Japanese task forces. 2 of them converged in the south. One was kind of in the, the western, coming in through the middle. And then you had the decoys up in the north. Now, the decoys in the north were going to draw Admiral Halsey and his carriers away from Leyte itself. Mm-hmm. And Halsey saw the carriers thinking it was the main force. He took the bait and he went after that force. Now, the Japanese, what they did was, I told you that there were 3 other task forces, 2 converged in the south, 1 was in the middle. They went and their goal was to annihilate the American forces left behind, like the troop transports and the troops themselves on the island of Leyte. So it almost worked. Read about it. The Japanese were annihilated. Yep. I mean, they lost their carriers, they lost half their battleships, they lost a third of their destroyers.
Pets' heads were falling off.
Something like that. Now, and there was a lot of, you remember, we've heard that old saying, uncommon valor is a common virtue. Admiral Nimitz said that about Iwo Jima, mind you. But, it happened where there were these little ships, little destroyers, carrier escorts, which are pretty small aircraft carriers. They went after and attacked the Japanese fleet. They had no business doing it because they had, I mean, you're talking about battleships attacking little destroyers. No chance in hell. But the American destroyers attacked anyway. And also the Australian Navy was there too. So they were part of this battle. We don't want to deprive Australia. But it was a humiliating defeat for Japan. They never were able to mount a big operation since then, afterwards. And by capturing the Philippines, we cut off Japanese oil supplies from the East Indies. So it was
very interesting.
Quite a victory.
So from now on, I guess I will take it as a compliment whenever you call me you little ship. So thank you. All right,
Yeah,
so here's my choice. Here's my This Week in History. October 25th, 1854. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Now, that is from the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Tennyson.
Wait a minute. No, that's Michael Oher and The Blind Side.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So the Charge of the Light Brigade took place during the Crimean War. This was a war between Russia and the British, French, the Ottoman Empire, and your buddies, the Sardinians. So during the Battle of Balaclava, Lord Fitzroy, this is going to be a great name, Lord Fitzroy Somerset Raglan, the British commander-in-chief for the British in Crimea, ordered the light and heavy brigades to advance with the infantry now against the Russians when he thought they were making off with a bunch of artillery guns. Somehow the orders got confused, and there was a long delay, people just sitting around, and then all of a sudden he's like, what are you people doing? Get out there, go. And all of a sudden the Light Brigade takes off. Now, they weren't really sure of where they were supposed to go, so they asked Raglan's aide-de-camp, like, hey, where are we supposed to attack? And it is said that, allegedly, that he just was like, over there, and they really weren't sure exactly over where there was, and so they headed in more or less the wrong direction. Long story short, you've got the Light Brigade taking off by itself toward an unintended attacking position with about 600 plus cavalry. It was a 1.25 mile long charge. Bad idea. So cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them, literally into the mouth of hell. That was just smoke and death everywhere. They made it to the line, smashed into the Russians, but they had lost about a 40% casualty rate. And when they got there, they're like, we got nothing else to do now because now we're getting more or less slaughtered. The heavy brigade was behind them to an extent, but when they were seeing what was going on, they're like, yeah, we're not going to have any part of this. So they turned around, headed back. Eventually, the Light Brigade, what was left of it, turned around and came back. Now, History.com, I did want to mention this. This is sort of, to an extent, how things can get a little off history as far as retelling history. History.com, the article on the Charge of the Light Brigade, stated at the beginning of the article that 500 plus people died, soldiers died during the Crimean War, and said that was more than the American Civil War. Now, you and I know that the standard number is around 600,000 died during the American Civil War. Now, this article was written in 2014, but in 2012, there was new research that was released that said that it looks like there was more, probably around 750,000 who died during the American Civil War. So I thought that was pretty interesting to bring up. So, yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, we hope you enjoyed that. That is This Week in History. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we've got two extremely very special guest friends of ours. Now, I don't think you've met Judge Wise. I've met him. We've hung out. but Dr. Hardin is a very close friend of ours.
Yes, he's a friend.
Yeah,
He's letting
it's
me.
very cool that we get to call him a friend.
Yes, I am privileged that he's letting me read some of his chapters before he releases them in his next book.
Yeah, I know that what you're trying to do is one up me, but I also got to read one of his chapters too.
I read 2 of his chapters.
Well,
I'm about
okay,
to read
so
a third.
Oh boy,
Yep.
I understand. I get it.
Hey, I've been a fan of his much longer.
No, I get it.
You
I
were
get it.
You were what, a toddler when I read his? Well, okay. How?
I was not a toddler.
10. You're about 10 years old.
I was about 13, 14. So you read it in what, 94, 95?
Yeah.
Okay, I was born in 81, you stupid idiot.
Oh, I thought you were born in 87. Why did
all
I
right.
think you were
So Dr. Stephen Hardin, he is the author of a number of Texas history books. Our personal favorite, Texian Iliad, Texian Macabre. Did you finally finish that?
No, I'm kind of going.
Still
But
going through
but I'm reading Texas Macabre. I'm reading Dr. Hardin's chapters.
It's Macabre.
Macabre.
I'm
Macabre?
gonna
I thought it was
slap you down.
Macabre. I'm reading that. I'm reading his chapters that he's sending me. And then I'm still reading Dr. Critchlow's book about revolutionary monsters. And I'm taking care of, our studio audience.
Well played.
Yes.
All right. So he's also the author of Lust for Glory. He's a professor of history at McMurry University, and he's just flat out awesome. And he also spoke at our very first history event that took place in April of this year. So we are thrilled to have him on the show again. And we've also got Judge Kenwise, Justice Kenwise. He is a justice for the 14th Circuit Court of Appeals here in Texas. And he's also the founder of a wonderful podcast that I love to listen to, Wise About Texas. What a play on words. Fantastic. So without further ado, we've got Dr. Hardin and Justice Wise on the show. How are both of you doing, guys?
Very well. Thank you very much for having me tonight.
I'm old, fat, and ugly, but thanks for asking.
Well, we
I'm gonna let you have that one.
man, I so want to add on to that, but I'm gonna let that one just pass on by. Thank you for being so candid. All right, so we wanted to have y'all both on for this conversation. One, obviously, Judge, you work in law, so that's an obvious thing. And Dr. Hardin, you are knee deep, elbow deep in history. I've been doing this for God knows how long, Texas history. And something that has been going on for quite some time, especially in this country, is combining advocacy with trying to tell accurate history. And we want to sort of discuss this and get y'all's takes on sort of the potential fallouts and potential benefits of combining those two, or should they remain separate? So I guess, Stephen, I'm gonna address you first and have you take this question first. But my first question is, in light of recent works like the 1619 Project and Forget the Alamo, and we mentioned those two because we had conversations here recently. We had Dr. Mary Graybar, who wrote Debunking the 1619 Project, and we had Denton Florian to talk about Forget the Alamo. But in light of these two works and many others, what are the dangers of combining advocacy with retelling history?
Well, I believe that the two instances that you've mentioned, these projects have been thoroughly discredited. I believe serious historians find them pernicious, but I think they also find them laughable. And the interesting thing, which nobody ever seems to notice, none of these efforts are advanced by professional historians. They're all coming from journalists. And I'm remembering something that conservative pundit R. Emmett Tyrrell said one time. He said, a journalist is a person who with experience writes worse. And that's not only is it boneheaded and pernicious, most of this stuff is positively unreadable. So there's that. Maybe their inability to write is actually to our advantage in this case. But they are clearly writing for a niche audience who is ready to receive their message. But I don't know that it's resonating with most of the folks out there. I mean, most of the folks out there, one, aren't interested in history to begin with. And I think especially they're not interested with doctrinaire or what passes for doctrinaire history.
Well, I come at it from an interesting angle, this particular question, because advocacy is part of my business, and so is history. And advocacy is not only part of my business, it's how I get to be a judge because we're elected in Texas. So I know a little bit about advocacy and taught it for a decade at the University of Houston Law School, trial advocacy. So building on what Dr. Hardin said, that niche audience, whatever they think the audience is, I'm not in it. They're not going to fool me. And I think that, and as I've gotten more serious about history and have sought to hang around people like Dr. Hardin, who I've cultivated as a mentor, whether he knows it or not, and admire very much, I've learned what professional historians do because, lawyers are trained historians. Our playing field is a little more structured, but it's the same principles. And so I feel like that has helped me as I've gotten more, so to speak, academically oriented when it comes to appreciating Texas history and writing and speaking about it. All of that to say that advocates start at a conclusion and they go backwards into the past, seeking facts that support that conclusion and ignoring or criticizing facts that don't support their conclusion. A good historian, in my view, starts with the facts in the past and follows them. And the conclusion is wherever those facts lead the historian, wherever the research leads, that's the conclusion. And so that's the difference as I view it. And I think it's useless. Advocacy is not very useful. My fear, though, is that the niche audience for these books is viewed as most of the people, for the same reasons Dr. Hardin said. Most people don't understand why history is so important, and they tend to ignore it. And the problem is they're vulnerable to advocacy that's marketed as history. And we're in a rough time right now because there's a lot of it. You named two particular projects. And, it didn't take long for real historians to debunk both of those projects fairly thoroughly. But it's dangerous. Now, I'll add to this. I know that over time, the authors of both of the works that you mentioned were forced to admit that it's not history publicly. And both of them have had to do that because the history community came at them and said, this is not history. It's an attempt to start an argument.
And I think, to your point, I think that, or to both of y'all's points, I think that sort of the idea behind journalism is to start an argument or start a debate. I graduated from Sam Houston State with a journalism degree. And so I was in journalism for 7 years, and that was my whole focal point was taking the immediate, what was taking place right now. And if I wanted to, bring to light certain things that I thought were important, I would hammer down on those particular things. And I think in a lot of ways, journalism or journalists do that. They take whatever it is that they're starting with the end in sight first, and then taking the information that they want to use or need to use in order to get that that point across, and using that. And to Dr. Hardin's point about it not being readable, we are taught in journalism school to write at the 6th grade level, so that may have something to do with it as well. And I think it is also, to your point, that there aren't a lot of people who are interested in history, but if social media, especially Twitter, is going haywire about something in particular, a topic in particular, especially a new book, or if somebody famous, gets on there and says, you need to read this book, people who don't read, typically will go out and get that book. And I think it sort of creates that firestorm. Now, so my next question is, so we see the works like this as really biased. You've got historians that have come out against both of these works, a number of other works, and said, hey, this is not real history. This is advocacy, or this is, to an extent, lunacy as well. But they're often dishonest or oversimplified. But from what you've read, and this is primarily, I guess, for Dr. Hardin, but from what you've read and experienced, have older texts, even contemporary works, been dishonest or oversimplified in their accounts? And this is sort of a multi-layered question. The contemporary works, have they themselves, for whatever reasons, been dishonest or oversimplified? And if so, do you see these recent works as recourse for that? And ultimately, how do you create a proper and accurate balance?
Well, to answer your question, yes. Older, more traditional narratives have been oversimplified. I think consciously sugar-coated, for lack of a better word. I am not suggesting that the history we write should be Chamber of Commerce boosterism. And I know you've read my books, and I don't think I could ever be accused of that. I am sometimes, God knows, I've gained the ire of many Sam Houston groupies, and again, not from my criticism of the general, just for having reported what his men said about him. Forget what Steve Hardin says. This is what the people who lived in 1836. And but when I brought out Texian Iliad in 1994, boy, that's been a long time ago, and that book has never been out of print, for which I am grateful. But I thought, in fact, I was a little nervous about this, because in that book I talk about Travis contemplating surrendering. I say without equivocation that Crockett was murdered after the battle. I just, I don't say this is a controversy. It's not a controversy to me. I was critical of his generalship. So, there was, I thought I was going to get a lot of grief for that. And in fact, I didn't. And I think the reason I didn't is because while I suggested an alternate narrative, my tone was not one of disparagement. And some of these new guys, and I say new guys because in many cases they're young, but in other cases they're new to history. And it seems to me that all they have to contribute is their disparagement. I mean, that's all they got. That, but once you've said, your ancestors were real rascals and oppressors, what else you got? That gets old very quickly. And again, I think they're trying to fool people. I think they're trying, because the evidence does not support their interpretation. Now, what they all fall back on, and what the authors of the most recent book have said, was, well, this is our opinion, and we're entitled to our opinion. Well, true. But when your opinion is based on nonsense, I don't think the rest of us are obliged to take you too seriously as historians, are indeed as reasonable human beings.
Well, that I don't know what I could add. You asked about older works that are biased or simplified, and I think what I might say about that is, history evolves with the subject of the history. In our case, Texas. The earliest histories of Texas, written in the mid 1800s, are going to be different, and you should expect them to be different than the histories written in the middle 1900s, for example, or 2021. But what you should always expect is honesty. And that's what I hear when I listen to Dr. Hardin, is there's a difference between history and just dishonest advocacy or whatever. And that's a problem. That's a real problem, because it all gets marketed as history. If it were marketed as opinions, fine, you can take it or leave it. But if it's marketed as history, it's very dangerous, because history is going to build our society no matter what we say about it. And so it's important that we're honest about it. So, for example, when Texas was young, what was it like? Well, we just won a couple of wars by the middle 1800s against Mexico, and nobody was interested in the history of Tejanos in Texas, because they had just lived it and experienced it. It was too soon. And so you could say, well, that was, they excluded that. Well, yeah, they did. And you should expect them to. The histories that we have. You're going to have to go, somewhere else to find the history you seek. But by the time Texas has become integrated, which it most certainly has in 2021, and the cultures have melded, which they most certainly have in 2021, and more than just Anglo-Tejano culture, all the cultures that have made Texas in 2021 what it is, then our history is going to look a lot different when you write it down. And that's a good thing. It grows. But at every point along that line, honesty is the key. And what we're seeing now is some dishonesty, frankly. I mean, there's no other way to put it.
Yeah, that's one of my
concerns. Also, in what people have to understand, and Ken's right, history evolves. And I lose patience sometimes with people who say, well, the problem is with this damned revisionist history. Okay, understand something. As a professional historian, every time I write an article or a book, I am expected to make, quote, an original contribution to knowledge. So in other words, if you read one of Steve Hardin's articles, or books, you need to learn something that you can't find anywhere else. You got to know that Steve has gone into the archives and dug up some information, or else has a startling new interpretation about the documents that everybody else already has. So if you don't have new information to share with the public, or if you don't have a new interpretation, don't write a book. We already have too many of those that just rehash old hash. Because let's face it, that's what most people do. So, by definition, if I bring new information to the table, I am going to revise the historical record. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. So, if you call me a revisionist, I'm going to say, well, yeah, sure. And so I do not see the term revisionist as a pejorative. I see, we should revise history. We should dig and find new information. And I would hope that when people read my books, they will sometimes pause and say, well, darn, I've never read that anywhere before. Where did Hardin get that? And they can follow my, number to the end notes, and well, here he is. Okay, good to know. But that's not, so the people we're talking about are not necessarily revisionist historians, because that's just good, honest history. But if you're saying American hating, Texas hating, race baiting, all of those would be more appropriate terms to what people actually dislike. But revisionism shouldn't be an ugly word to people. It's just what we do. And again, if you find new information and share it, you're going to revise the historical record. And otherwise, we just go back and read A Time to Stand for the 15th time.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my concerns too, is sort of combining y'all's two comments on you're taking a lot of these works are taking old texts, old works, and giving them a new angle instead of, oh, I have discovered this new information that's actually historical, and here's a new way to look at it, or the proper way to look at it in its proper context. And I think what you said earlier, Judge, was spot on. Was you're just labeling it history, and so just take it as history, believe it as history, despite the fact that it's not. And it's interesting. I mean, it follows up right into our next question about we've got enough document or bios on certain figures, especially if you're not pulling anything out new.
Well, we went to Fredericksburg a couple of weeks ago, and the general, 4-star general, he was the commandant of the Marine Corps at one point, I think the 33rd or something, and he had a complaint stating that the recent Midway movie that came out didn't really highlight Dory Miller and the subject of, say, the Tejanos. I know that I really didn't know the contributions of the Tejanos until I read the Texian Iliad. And then I hear other complaints from people saying, Bernardo de Galvez does not get enough credit for his contributions to the American Revolution. So this will go to my next question, in that, why have so many history makers been either ignored or not discussed? Is it because is it because their contributions, were they, minuscule, minor, or is it because maybe a bias? Or is it because maybe what these people did, and I'll give an example, Dory Miller. What Dory Miller did was brave, but I think it was Nimitz who said about Iwo Jima that uncommon valor was a common virtue. So were these acts common? Why is it that so many history makers are just not mentioned, or they're not mentioned enough? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll take that one just because you mentioned Dory Miller, and I did a podcast on Dory Miller, and he did a very brave thing, firing. He was a cook, and he was a cook because, or one of the reasons he was a cook in the Navy at Pearl Harbor is because African Americans were not allowed to be many other things in the Navy at that time. And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he ran to an anti-aircraft gun, fired at the Japanese aircraft, downed a number of them. We don't know for sure how many. His ship was attacked. He went to the bridge and held the dying captain in his arms and wouldn't leave him. And that's an act of heroism, an act of bravery. But I would also submit it's an act that is expected of good sailors. And he did his duty, and he did it well. Did he go above and beyond the call? Probably yes. And he deserves every honor that he's earned. He's earned every one of them. That has nothing to do with his race. He did that because he's a good man. I would argue a good Texan and a good sailor. Now, the fact that he did all that at a time where that probably was surprising to people because of certain conditions in society, okay, that's not insignificant. But that does not define Dory Miller. What defines Dory Miller is his status as an American hero and a good man. And so I think what you can see through that story is an effort to incorporate into the American fabric or the Texan fabric everyone that has done well in our state's history. Now, it's taken a while to get to that point, and that's what we were talking about earlier. Maybe that wasn't discussed in 1850, but it darn sure is discussed in 2021, and in the 180 years between, sorry, I went to A&M, 140 years, whatever it is, between, it certainly has been discussed. So this idea that from the authors that we've been criticizing, that they're discovering something new, that's nonsense. And I would argue that we should continue down the path of including more historical stories and of people who have done great things, no matter who they are or what they look like. Now, if you want to put it in context of the times and say, well, the times were not perfect, okay, fine. That's the conditions under which the history was made, but it's not the history. The history is what these people have done. And so we've been doing that over the past centuries in Texas history and in American history, and we ought to continue. And I enjoy hearing about those things because we live in a state where all of the cultures have been assimilated and have created the place, Texas, the place that we love, is a product of so many different cultures. We ought to be interested in learning the history of people who grew up in those specific circumstances. And I certainly am.
I agree with everything Ken just said. The very first piece I ever got published in a Phi Alpha Theta journal. Phi Alpha Theta is the History Honor Society. As a grad student, was an article, a piece I wrote on the Tejano contribution to the Texas Revolution. So from the very beginning of my career, I've been aware of the Tejano contribution. You know who have read my books. I acknowledge it. Uh, I've always been associated with that sort of history. So it is puzzling to me as I now come to the end of my career that suddenly I find myself labeled as a traditionalist and a triumphalist. I I have certainly never regarded myself in those terms. And earlier in my career, I was considered something of a young Turk, who was challenging the status quo. But I really lose patience with people who, without a lot of evidence, say, well, Tejano history has been ignored in Texas. Our African American history has been ignored by Texas history. Our women have been ignored in Texas history. And you know what? When I started in this biz 40 years ago, that was probably true. That is not true now. It is simply not true. And the people who continue to assert that are just repeating a trope. It's if you doubt me, pick up a 7th grade Texas history text, and I promise you there is more in that. Count the number of words about Juan Seguin, and there will be more words on Juan Seguin than William Barrett Travis or Jim Bowie. That's okay. I mean, but to assert that these constituency groups have been ignored just flies in the face of all evidence. Have you read a copy of Southwestern Historical Quarterly lately? Lately held within the last 30 years? It's almost entirely race, class, and gender, because that's all that's coming out of graduate schools these days. If you are a graduate student who wants to do a more traditional topic, you are going to have a hard time finding a dissertation or thesis supervisor, because that's just out of vogue. You create your own niche. And if you teach Tejano history, or if you teach women's history, or if you teach African American history, to keep yourself relevant, you have to keep beating this drum. And I think it's in many cases they've done it so long it's a knee-jerk response that my fill-in constituency group in the blank has been overlooked. So you need to give me that grant money. You need to give me tenure, because I represent an underrepresented ethnic group. Now you can go to them and say, well, maybe you were 30 years ago, but not anymore. Well, they can't let go of that, because and you know what? They can't even admit things are better, and that's what I resent. We are, and listen, I'm old. I can remember how race relations used to be in the 60s. We've made enormous strides. But if I say that, and I do, I'm dismissed as a traditionalist. I'm dismissed as a triumphalist. If I don't constantly preach the gospel of gloom and doom, Sturm und Drang, somehow I'm not a serious historian, but I get that. I get that. And, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm coming to the end of it. I don't see myself doing it too much longer. And it's sad to be at this point in my career because I worked hard to get here, and to come to the end of my career and actually be ashamed of what my profession has become. It's disheartening. It's disheartening.
It is interesting that the institutions in America are failing us, and this is coming from his history to the legal profession to journalism to academia as a whole to the medical community. I mean, these major institutions in the U.S. are showing themselves to be failing us. But moving on to our last question, and this is a twofold question. One side is for you, Judge, and the other one is for you, Stephen. For you, Judge, you got this question. You had mentioned more or less to an extent like we don't need the negativity and the division. Like that's not what we need, and obviously it's not what we need because it only sows discord. But what do you see? You have a podcast that's very successful, and you are at the ground level on what's going on in sort of the movements in Texas history and what people are doing. What do you see, and what do you encourage people, the average citizen, even the average parent, and to an extent, I almost am leaning towards advocating in this question for homeschooling, but that's not really what I'm going at. But what do you see, and what are you encouraging people to do to sort of bridge the divide, but also break in between just everything being about race or and gender, or specifically oppressor versus the oppressed and everything. And then for Dr. Hardin, what do you see as far as what can average readers do to make sure that they're reading or they're learning an accurate retelling of history? And Judge, if you can take the first part of that.
I'll try. That's pretty deep. I would say if you read history of any kind, you will understand that people in general, humans, and you can go back to the Old Testament, all of human history, people are tribal by nature, whatever you want to define that. The great thing about the United States Constitution and the government that the founders created, and it's not enough to just read the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, try to understand where they were coming from and what they were designing. What they designed was a structure under which people of all tribes, to use that word, all religions, all views, could live together. And the structure necessitates a couple of very important things: that the law and that structure applies to everyone equally, and no one is above it. And that you have to respect that. So we agree to trade a little bit of our tribal natures, give up a few of the things we'd like to do in exchange for the opportunity to maximize our freedom despite our differences. And that is, I heard someone compare it to carving a garden out of the jungle. If you don't tend that garden meticulously and regularly, the jungle will take it back. And that's the American experiment. And we're not tending the garden very well. Yeah. And we can argue about why that is, but we're not. And the jungle will take it back. And the jungle taking it back is identity politics. It is people who don't vote or don't care to vote or don't cast informed votes. It's people who bebop through their day and don't care about current events. And when you have people when you have an uninformed citizenry who's not participating in cultivating that garden, they're very vulnerable to anybody that comes along and sells them some agenda, and it's never going to be expressed in a negative way. No one's ever going to come up to you and say, hey, I want to pit you against this person because you're this and they're that. And I'm going to pit you against them. And as long as I do that, I'm going to maintain power over y'all. They're never going to tell you that. What they're going to talk about is things that make you feel good. Or they're going to tell you you're oppressed and I'm going to save you. So when you hear those messages, that's what you're seeing. And it's a spirit of division. There's a purpose behind it. And I know this isn't a political podcast. There's a purpose behind that. And so I would just, whoever's listening to this, tend that garden, join together. It's a beautiful thing that we can all live together despite our differences. And unfortunately, as I think I mentioned earlier, that spirit of division infiltrates every area of our society, and it's putting our system under a lot of pressure right now. So I think it's time that we get together, focus on what unites us, not what divides us. It astounds me how willing people are to divide and to hate their neighbor for things that really don't affect their lives. You know, who you voted for, or whether you stand on your left foot or your right foot for the national anthem. You know, I mean, come on. Now, the good news is I think most of the people are not like that. I think we just hear about it out of proportion to its existence. But it's time to speak up and it's time to speak up.
I teach a course for freshmen. It's an entry-level course called Making History. And we initiated this course at McMurry University because so many of our incoming history mates were so ill-equipped to do college-level work. They claimed to have an interest in history, but it became clear they knew almost nothing about history. So instead of cursing the darkness, we decided to light a candle and initiate this new course and teach these beginning neophyte historians basically what they needed to know. And I do a unit called Reading History. And people say, well, how do I know it's a good book until I read it? And I said, no, there are ways. You know, when I'm in a bookstore and I'm contemplating buying a book, or I'm on Amazon or whatever, and now again, I'm talking about nonfiction, you know, not novels, you know. But the first thing I do is I go, does it have a bibliography? If it doesn't have a bibliography, it's not a serious work of history. Put it back on the shelf. Now, if it does have a bibliography, is it extensive? Does it have a varied assortment of primary and secondary sources? And probably most important for me, does it have archival sources? Because if the author has not dug in the archives, I know he or she cannot have made an original contribution to knowledge. So basically, a bibliography will tell a potential reader, has this person done their homework? So that's the first hurdle. Once they get past that hurdle, I go to the table of contents. And reading through the table of contents, I try to get a sense of the book, the scope of the book, what historical period does this book cover, in what detail. And then if it seems like a book that would engage my interest, okay, that's the second hurdle. And then I go to chapter 1 and I read the first 5 pages. And if I get to the end of those 5 pages and I want to read further, I know that the book is written with a sense of style. But if I want to plunge knitting needles into my eyes because the prose is so turgid, I you know, and actually a lot of books fail at the third hurdle. But especially at my time of life, life is simply too short to read bad books. And if a book is not well researched and a book is not well written, I don't have time for that book. And another thing, and this has to do with tone, the tone of the book. And that is where so many books today fall short, especially of the race, class, and gender variety of books, because they are more well, they're polemics. They're not history. They're trying to advance a political agenda, and they're not even subtle about it anymore. And God, I sound so much back in my day. But seriously, when I was in graduate school, we were taught that our prose, and the word was measured. It should be measured. We shouldn't use loaded language. And you were discussing the most recent book, which purports to be on the Alamo, but actually, the remarkable thing about that book is how little it actually says about the Alamo. It says a lot about how the authors feel about the Alamo, but you're not going to read that book and find any new information about the Alamo. Again, it's you're going to discover an attitude about the Alamo. But I was so amazed at some of the language in that book. And not only was it bad, I was expecting it to be bad history, but it was even bad journalism. Because they used to teach journalists you can't you can't be so what's the word, exploitative, I guess. So people can, I think, if judging the tone, if you get the impression someone's trying to convert you rather than inform you, you can be sure that there's a problem with that book.
Thanks again, Dr. Hardin. Thanks again, Judge. Great to have you on the show. Judge, how often does your podcast release an episode? Is it weekly?
No, I wish I had time to do it weekly. The state of Texas wants me to show up for work during the day. So it's every 2 to 4 weeks. My listeners start sending emails after about 3 weeks. So, it just depends. Also depends on how deep I'm going on each episode. So we have some episodes that are researched at a journal article level, and some that are just fun stories. But the spirit of the podcast is that we're all in this together. We live in the greatest state in the nation, and it's because of our history, and it's because of our culture, and I want to keep it that way.
Amen to that. Yeah. And Dr. Hardin, you're working on a new book. I know Alan and I have gotten the opportunity to read the first chapter, which is extremely exciting. Do you want to give a little touchstone onto what it is that you're putting together?
Sure, be pleased to. Uh, I am writing, have been writing for some time and researching for a longer time, a book about the 1836 runaway scrape. And and the reason I want to write this book is that even here in Texas, a lot of people, you say, well, I'm writing a book about the runaway scrape, and just blank stares. It's obvious, even here in Texas, that people have forgotten about the runaway scrape. And for people who may not be familiar, the runaway scrape was the mass exodus of Texian civilians in, during the Texas Revolution in an attempt to get to the U.S. border or to Galveston Island, across the Sabine, across the Red, in their efforts to evade Santana's advancing Mexican army. Yeah, I'm probably biased, but I think it's the best thing I've ever written.
Oh, wow. Well, then, yeah. I mean, we're already looking forward to reading it, so even more so. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hardin, for all your work, and Judge, thank you so much for all that you do, and for both of you for helping preserve Texas history and doing all that you can. I know we're big fans of both. Thanks again for being on the show, guys.
Always
Thanks
a
for
pleasure.
having me.
How did you manage to get both of them at the same time? That was a, what's that word? Fait d'accompli or whatever.
Fate.
I don't know. My
how do you
French
say?
sucks right now.
Fait
I've been
d'accompli.
taking the Duolingo to learn French and Italian, mind you.
Oh, yeah, that
fait
reminds me.
Fait d'accompli or something.
It reminds me, I got to continue learning French. Enchanté de te rencontrer.
Savala something. I don't know.
There you go.
We're not here to learn French. We're here to learn history.
You know what? It was pretty awesome. So getting them, both of them, obviously. I mean, you had reached out to Dr. Hardin, what, 2 years ago, I want to say?
Something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So friend of the show, obviously wanted to have him on for this season, and Judge Wise, he came out after our event, and I met him. We all had breakfast together. Mm-hmm. So it was me and Stephen, Denton, Jody, and
so he was the other
Wise.
one.
Yeah,
Okay.
he was there with us. So
Yeah.
he and I connected. Then we went and met for lunch. And then I was like, "Hey, man, it'd be great to have you on the show." And so, we're.
I mean, I've heard of him and I've seen him before, but this is the first time I've ever talked to him. So
yeah, he's awesome. But yeah, nailed it again. And speaking of, we're gonna have another awesome Texas historian. We're gonna have Don Frazier on next week, and he's actually part of the 1836 commission that Governor Abbott recently put together. So
Okay,
that's
good.
gonna be a fun conversation.
yeah, we're gonna need that right about now.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We have
man.
to
And
advocate for,
we have to advocate for accurate history.
Accurate
I mean,
history.
that's where we are.
Well, I was gonna mention, like myths. We talked about the people who are ignored and what, and there's kind of a move right now. One of them that comes to mind is Bass Reeves. I think that's his name.
Yeah.
Where there wasn't really much talked about him. But there was a guy who wrote a book, I think in the 90s, that hinted at the possibility that the Lone Ranger was written about him. And there's no evidence to back up that claim or that assertion. And I didn't really know that much about the guy. But for me, if you're going to tell a story, make sure that you're not creating a myth. Like David Crockett, there was a myth about him. I thought the guy used to beat up bears, and
Yeah, I mean, I got that as a child. Like for Christmas one year, a book on Davy Crockett, where he shot in the nose a bear and a mountain lion by shooting a rock, and it split in two.
Oh, wow.
And then there was a comet heading towards Earth, and he grabbed it and he ran up, a mountain cliff and grabbed it by the tail and twirled it back. I mean,
But that wasn't presented as
Right,
real
as
history.
real
It
yeah.
It was, some of it was
but it's
just
still
tongue-in-cheek.
mythological,
Right, right. And if you're going to read a book about history, and I'm going to mention this about movies, is that, like there was a recent movie that came out, well, when I say recent, the last 20 years, about the Alamo, and it gave a really true to life version of how David Crockett was. He wasn't this, like the John Wayne version. It was more realistic. But like with the Bass Reeves thing, I keep seeing, and the Texas Monthly jumped in on this. They keep pushing.
Yeah.
That Lone Ranger was about Bass Reeves when he wasn't even a Texas Ranger. And I've actually talked, I talked to Jody about. He's a Texas Ranger historian, and it's like, they're pushing this narrative. It's an advocacy for history that they feel has been neglected. But okay, great. Then tell the story. I'm sure there's a great story
wind
about
up building your advocacy on a house of cards, because
Right.
when people come to find out, like, you're just making this stuff up to prop up your agenda, not even the person.
Yeah.
Because you don't need to create something out of Bass Reeves' story.
Yeah,
the guy was freaking awesome.
He was. There is
So-
a greatness to him, and I
Yeah.
want that story to be told, and I want people to know who he is, but not on a false story that
Exactly.
does a disservice to him, because then his real exploits are not going to be discussed.
Right. Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So good point.
thank
Well, I
you.
enjoyed the
Thank you.
conversation
I
too.
did. I did.
Yeah.
So there you go.
There you have it.
All right.
There
so,
it is.
Well, now let's. What do you say we talk about our book and movie recommendations?
There you go. I like this.
You like this?
I like having you guide the conversation.
I always tell people you're more of like the director and the producer and the creator, and I'm just the talent. I'm the guy that throws shit around saying, I can't work under these conditions.
There you go. Where's
So,
my trailer?
Yeah, but why don't you start off with your book and movie
Oh,
recommendation?
fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, dang it. Dang. Okay. Oh, well, that's fine. They're VHS anyways.
Oh. I know what you're going to talk about. Didn't I bring up?
Yeah,
No,
probably.
no. You
but
know what? No, I did Bob Hope and Bing Crosby.
Yeah. Bing Crosby with the Where To or something like that.
Dorothy Lamour. The Road 2 movies.
The Road to. So, all right, book and movie recommendation. My movie recommendation, ladies and gentlemen, it is still October. So my movie recommendation, I'm not a big fan of like hardcore horror stuff. I don't like it. I don't like the Saw stuff. I don't like the Rob Zombie stuff. That would just disturb me for a very long time. Now, I am a fan of like the Stephen King stuff, like The Shining and It and all that. But something a little more subtle, maybe something that your kids can watch too, is Bud Abbott and Lou Costello Meet.
They did meet Frankenstein. That was
Frankenstein.
a horror movie. It had Wolfman, Dracula.
They meet Frankenstein on the Meet Frankenstein. They meet Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein, right? And Dr. Frankenstein. And they meet the Wolfman. That's a funny one. They meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They meet the Mummy. And there's one that hold that ghost. So there's a lot in the Invisible Man. So they did all these, Abbott and Costello meet. And so they're all really fun, and they are funny. It's like Abbott and Costello are two of my favorite comedians even today. Even though we're about 80 years past when they were like in their prime and doing their thing, they are still some of my favorite comedians. And what they would put together and write, they were so funny. Just their bits, just the epitome of the straight man and the just the goof off, right?
Yeah, like Laurel and Hardy.
Laurel
and
and
you
Hardy,
had
but
Martin and Lewis.
Yeah.
No, you had of them. You had Laurel and Hardy, Martin and Lewis.
Right.
You had the Marx Brothers. I mean, you had a lot of funny.
And like Laurel and Hardy, I think were a little before.
They were
Abbott and Costello. And
Oh,
I think Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin were obviously sort of after Abbott and Costello, but still sort of in that same time frame. But anyways, if you haven't yet, Abbott and Costello, they're so fun. All right, so my book recommendation, I read this a very long time ago, and I still remember it vividly, and I think it is fitting for the month of October. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Have you ever read any of her stuff before?
I've not read. I think I've seen.
Seen like the shows and yeah.
I saw like the
movies.
Murder on the Orient Express one time, and then Death on the Nile.
Yeah, they're supposed to come out with the full-fledged new movie, Death on the Nile, and I'm glad that you brought that up because it is so irritating how it falls right in line with what we're talking about, this advocacy stuff that is, sort of making the water murky to where you can't see, what something, or you can't even appreciate something, right? The Observer, which I think is part of the Telegraph the Guardian, I apologize, the Guardian. So the Observer, which is, very left-leaning, they wrote a piece about Agatha Christie and her, I guess, perceived racism towards Asian people, right?
Okay.
And it's just like, as Dr. Hardin was talking about, that presentism, it's like you can't appreciate the books, you can't appreciate the art, because it has to always be through the lens of oppressor, oppressed. This person was a bad person. Let's create enemies. Let's create the good guys. Let's create the bad guys. And it's never in the context of anything except how we want to view things today. So I ran across that article
Like
because
Little House on the Prairie. What's her name? Laura Ingalls.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's being
canceled. Yeah, I mean it's just enough already.
Dave
Chappelle
Chappelle was accused of white supremacy. Did you hear about that? Dave Chappelle. I don't know if it's because he played a Klansman one time. I don't know.
Black white supremacist.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when they put out Elder was the black face of white supremacy.
Oh, Larry Elder?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait a minute, I thought only Dave Chappelle could be like a black white supremacist. So, anyways, what a joke. Anyways, and Then There Were None is a fantastic read, and there's also hold on.
That's the first movie, the Agatha Christie movie I saw. It was 10 Little Indians.
Yeah.
Have you? I saw that. I didn't know that
in
that
black
was
and white.
Yeah.
You see the black and white version.
Yeah.
It's good. So you can watch the film actually on YouTube, or you can just read the book. But yeah, Death on the Nile is coming out, I believe, at the beginning of next year. So I'm looking forward to that. I enjoyed Murder on the Orient Express, but I did actually, honestly, enjoy the Poirot version, like the series version of Murder on the Orient Express, more than the movie that came out a couple of years ago.
I saw a movie, I think it was in the late 70s or early 80s, called Agatha. I think one of the Redgrave sisters was, I think there were two of them, Lynn, Vanessa, one of them, I don't know. I think one of them played Agatha Christie. And the movie's called Agatha.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that your movie recommendation?
No. My movie recommendation is The Alamo, which came
for
out
the fifth time.
Well, you know what? Because
but
I have my reasons for it.
Here it is.
All right. Now, my reasons is that now there were two Alamo movies. There was the 1960 John Wayne version. It's not the one I'm talking about, although that is an entertaining movie.
Mm-hmm.
But if you watch the one with Billy Bob Thornton playing David Crockett, and you got that guy from that vampire movie playing Jim Bowie, Jason Patrick?
Jason Patrick, yeah.
And then you've got
Lost Boys.
What did I say? Yeah, the Lost Boys.
Lost Boys.
Yeah.
Vampire movie.
And then you got Dennis Quaid.
Yep, there's Sam Houston.
Playing Sam Houston. Although Russell Crowe would have been a bunch better.
Yeah, Patrick Wilson as William Barrett Travis.
Yes. And you had that one guy who always plays bad guys playing Juan Seguin. But it's a I liked it. I mean, it did kind of didn't do very well in the box office, but it was a realistic portrayal, and you could see the David Crockett was not presented as some guy that the mythology of him was not in that movie at all. It's discussed, because everyone's like, "Oh, we have David Crockett," and David's like, "Wait, I thought the war was over." And then when he had to get out, and they were trying to burn up the little huts, and you could see in him that he was now a victim of his own fame.
Yeah.
So, and So that movie, it came out in 2004, 2005, somewhere around that time. It's a good movie, and it does show the Battle of San Jacinto in that movie. So I am going to recommend that movie because it does show a true portrayal. It's not a bunch of mythology. It's the real thing.
Yeah.
Now, our good friend of ours was a consultant in that movie, Dr. Stephen Hardin.
And he was.
And that's where I come in on the book recommendations. I'm just going to recommend his books in general.
Yeah.
I've read the Texian Iliad, loved it. I'm reading right now the Texas Macabre. If I said it correctly.
I think
Is
it's
it Macabre?
Texian Macabre.
What did I say? Oh,
Texas.
man. Texian Macabre. Macabre.
Whatever.
I'm reading that right now, along with Dr. Critchlow's book, mind you. But his and I'm reading, some of his chapters. The guy's just an amazing writer. He's detailed in his history. He's the reason why I know about the Tejano contributions in the Texas Revolution. So you're not going to go wrong. Read his books. I would say read Texian Iliad and then read some of his other books.
Yeah.
When you read that first book, you're going to love the rest. So there you go.
There you go. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that brings our show to an end. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to where?
Our YouTube channel.
That's right. And
Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. And if we are going to be, shadow banned or whatever it is by all three at some point, because I do think we have been, we do have our own website, www.thesonsofhistory.com. By the way, I did post some stuff on Gab and MeWe.
I didn't even
don't
know
know
we
if
still had
Rumble?
those.
Yeah, I haven't. I
actually put up our first video on Rumble. So
Rumble.
we are on Rumble as well. I put that up actually this week.
I think you need to go to mine to go to see the. I put like Dr. Critchlow's interview on both Gab and in MeWe. So if you're
Fascinating.
look for me. Oh, and that other one, that red one, the one that was shut down, that begins with a P.
Parlor.
Parlor. I put it on Parlor also. So look for me. Look for my name, and if you.
We'll keep an eye out.
Yeah, if you're banned from YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, you can.
You
Fine.
can come hang out with us. All right,
That's
ladies
right.
and gentlemen, that is it for the show. Thank you very much for watching. We're going to have a great podcast again next week with Don Frazier. Looking forward to that. All right, that's it. We'll talk to you later.